In the States, they have 300,000 let's call them SSIs a year. 9,000 of those lead to the patient dying. On average, they say in the States, each SSI leads to 7 to 10 extra days stay in hospital. We're talking about quite a lot of waste, aren't we? The average cost in the American system is just over $27,000. So that's costing the American system $10 billion a year with surgical site infections. An unknown percentage are believed to come from contaminated instruments, but some of those are coming from contaminated instruments. And there's a lot of published records saying people have died because of that contaminated instrument or another. So what I wanted to do today, this afternoon, is just look at some aspects of how we go safe from the SSD to the operating table, how we protect instruments from infection and damage, the stories around the benefits of containers versus wraps, and looking at transportation and storage. First of all, just a little aside, endoscope reprocessing. Some of you will know that we've been involved in a company called Cheeser, operating a system in this country which they're using in Wolverhampton, for example. And the beauty of this is that this is the only system that's currently available for an endoscope that comes from the pre-cleaning in the sink, goes into a cassette, the cassette gets closed, it goes through the AER at a level of chemical decontamination that sterilizes, stays in the cassettes into the storage, stays in the cassette through storage all the way to a point of use. It is the only system still around the place which has the same assurance, safety assurance that you would normally have with your surgical instruments. And there have been some challenges around the place with the system, but these days it works very well. And I think these guys at the back there, you could talk to them about that. So that's just talking about ideal transport systems, but that's not the main thing I'm talking about here. So I just want to bring you some information I've picked up from a couple of WFHSS meetings as to whether containers are bulletproof as they're made out to be. In the 2015 conference in Lille, there were two presentations that gave me concern. One was talking about the amount of water that still gets left in containers due to condensation, and the other was bacterial ingress, a bit more of that in a moment. And in Brisbane, a year ago, again, there was interesting presentation about bacterial ingress. But some of the data is a little bit concerning, and don't know if everybody's aware of it, and there are perhaps ways around it. One report then that showed that at least 9% of containers found to contain some water when they're opened. That obviously has to lead to a cancelled operation. That's not good news. Because the basis, if there's any moisture there, if there was one or two bacteria left, they could have been starting to grow. Now the causes of water being left inside containers comes from often cooling too quickly in the sterilizer, sometimes from the load arrangement, where the load has got in the way of the vacuum and the steam getting everywhere it should be at the right temperature. So that was just one report. The other one came from a Swiss presenter, and he's looking at the risk following closing up equipment into a container. And I've translated some of his slides. These are his slides, but I put the English translation into them. He's got 4 different establishments. That's the number of different containers at each establishment. 3 were brand X and 1 was brand Y. And the percentage that were not conforming, i.e. they were leaking or there was moisture inside them and so forth, those percentages, particularly 40%, is quite worrying, and 60% in the other one. So what happens during transportation? Here's a normal transportation trolley, and I'll move on. this is what was going on there. They were reprocessing down at lake level, and then the containers were taken up a few hundred meters up to a hospital up the hill, or up the mountain as they call them in Switzerland. We don't know what those are in Belgium, I know, and Holland. So, sea level, but lake level we're 379 meters. Up the mountain we're 577 meters, 200 meters going up the hill. So the consequences are that the pressure, the air pressure at lake level was 946 HPA, that's a Pascal unit of one type or another. And down at the edge, sorry, that's up the mountain, down the edge of the leak was 969. Using a little bit of physics, PV equals PV, basically that's saying that containers 27 litres at lake level will actually only have 26.4 litres at Ushi, up the mountain. So that means 0.6 litres of air are going to be sucked in to normalise the pressures. And when you look at outside air contains up to 100 million particles in the volume we're talking about, is the litre. And there's one bacterium in there, you'll actually be sucking in 6 bugs per container as you go up the mountain using the statistics. So this is a little bit worrying about the fact that all the ISO 11607 tests are done with constant pressures, and that'll come out in the next study. And this is a guy, Schaefer. This is a presentation he made in Brisbane, Harry Schaefer. He actually published a paper in the American Journal of Infection Control. That long title is what it was: Dynamic Evaluation of Sterilized Rigid Containers and Wrapped Instrument Trays to Prevent Bacterial Ingress. And just going back to a little bit of what the standards say, ISO 11607 Part 1 as it stands at the moment is that the sterile barrier system shall maintain sterility until the point of use or until the expiry date. And then there's an Australian version of one of the standards that say that the SBS shall protect the packaging and shall not impede the effective sterilization and maintain the sterility until the point of use. And the Americans have got their own AMI standards, and there they say the sterile barrier system shall maintain sterility until the containment device is opened and the sterile contents are aseptically presented. And definition of sterility maintenance is that you can verify it by performing the testing elsewhere in the standard, but you should be exposing the sterile barrier system to the expected stresses of storage, transport and handling conditions, and then performing either a whole package micro test or physical integrity tests. So those are all there in standards. But it's saying, don't put it in a static situation, put it through what it's normally going to go through to see whether your barrier system is actually working. And examples of expected stresses deal with moving in and out of the sterilizer, on and off shelving, onto carts, and stresses from vehicle vibration as things are being moved around, and so forth. So there are different elements where contamination can be brought in because of the changing pressures. Post-sterilization cool down. We know when it comes out the sterilizer it's been 134 degrees or whatever, is cooling it down. The temperature pressure changes as a result of it cooling can bring an air influx into the SPS, into the sterile packaging system. Within that, of course, we have filters often in the containers. But the studies done have shown that those filters are often got holes in them or are not working, or there's other places, like gaskets, where air is coming in. In storage, temperature differences will happen from one place to another. Again, as air gets warmed up and cooled down, it contracts and expands. There's air exchange in the environment during storage. Human traffic, opening and closing doors, quite often now well-sealed doors. You open the door, you can feel the air pulses against your ears. And in transport, just going different floors in the building, Americans call it elevated transport, the movement of the whole package and temperature pressure differences between locations all come into play. So quickly looking at reusable containers. The reusable means that this can exceed 1,000 uses. They're made of metal or ceramic materials top and bottom. They've got latches and closing mechanisms, interior and exterior. They've got gaskets, retention plates, retention clips, filters and so forth. There's lots of bits that have got things around them that can go wrong. And the filter and valves allow penetration of steam during an autoclave cycle, which is good. But these varying in size filters don't always work. And there's no way of testing whether they're working or not. So you get multiple non-detectable points of failure. And that's the critical thing really in the system. They're non-detectable. So is this a real issue or not? We'll have a look at the moment. Just quickly looking at the sterilization wrap. It's disposable, so it's single use. The wrap itself acts as a filter, available in different weights and grades. And we do know that in proper handling, somewhere along the line, you can get holes and tears. And we can hear more about that after tea. But if you get a failure, it is detectable because people hold the wrap up and look for the hole and say, oh, there's a hole, there's water in there, we can't use the instrument. So just looking at the two there, this study that Harry Schaefer did, he got some rigid containers and sterilization wraps. He got the containers from about a dozen hospitals. There are different designs. He tested this in the States and Canada. And these were containers that were considered to be ready for use. And the sterilization wraps, they used a new set of wraps for each test and looked at 3 grades of wrap. And he produced a new test model, which is this box here. A little bit more detail in a moment. He puts a bacterial challenge in there and then puts it through a simulated cycle of life for a couple of days to see what happened inside. So the pressure was changed. A bit more detail in a second. So they're designed to carry 8 packs at a time. They're putting in bacteria at 225 CFU per litre, which is about what you find normally in air. And then he had 2 pulses of 1 psi pressure change, but normally the study has shown that you probably in normal use get up to 2 psi, so this is not the full stresses normally seen. There's 3 pulses each of 0.7 and 0.4 psi pressure change, so there's a total of 8 pulses. They looked at 14 different hospitals, containers from there, and they used 4 designs of new rigid containers. And as I said a moment ago, 3 grades of sterilization wrap. Putting all those items through that test rig, 100% of the sterilization wrap ones, there were no bacteria came inside. Of the rigid containers, only 13% had no bugs inside at all. There's 18% had over 100 CFU. That is a heck of a lot of contamination. These include brand new rigid containers. And a little bit more of the study there. These were brand new unused ones. These were under 5 years old. The ones that are 5 to 9 years old. This is the range of data they've had. But you can see even the unused ones, quite a lot of them have values above 0 in there. So the outcome of the whole report was that with the wraps, they found no detectable bugs inside, and the devices are simple, and failure detection, holes, tears are detectable, whereas in the rigid ones, 72% of the new containers allowed in bacterial ingress. And the problem comes because there's so many different bits that you can't guarantee that they're going to be airtight. And that's brand new ones. After they've been thrown around, bashed around a bit, they really aren't that good for purpose. The Germans had a look at this paper, and they did a study, and they used a lowered bacterial load of only 2 CFU. Before it was 250. They still found that 60% of containers had ingress of bacteria. Their recommendation is if you're going to use a container, use a wrap on the inside. Well, why use a wrap on the inside? Because you could have used the wrap around a tray anyway. But for me, as somebody luckily hasn't had to go under a surgeon's knife, apart from when I had my tonsils out when I was very little, and knowing a lot of people using containers, I find this very worrying, particularly if the bugs are getting in and there's water inside for the bugs to grow in. And I know most people don't dare say anything out loud about containers because ICLAP have a very strong legal department, and all I'm doing is reporting what is published. I have no vested interests in wraps or containers, so I'm just reporting to you stuff that has come out of international conferences that you may not be aware of. And finally, we talk about sterilization wraps. We all know they leave the SSD in good condition, but arrive in theatre or with moisture damage or tears and holes. This usually is due to damage in transportation, so people are not carrying them around as they should do, or damage in storage where people will be hauling them on and off shelves in a way that's not really very good for the materials. So it's the movement in or off the shelves that is causing the problems.